My senior year of high school, I was on the basketball team, and before the season started, the coach would open up the gym for open gyms where we could come and scrimmage and just enjoy the game. There was no coaching that could happen at that point, so we really just scrimmaged. And so I was a senior, and there was a freshman who was playing with us in this particular day, and we were doing 5-on-5, and this freshman kept getting beat. And he was on my team, and he kept getting beat, not because the other person was better than him, but because he wasn't hustling. And so I got on him, I barked at him a little bit, like, hey, pick it up, let's go. And he kept getting beat, wasn't hustling. And in my mind, if you get beat because the other person's better than you, you know what, that is what it is. You got to tip your hat to him. But if you get beat because you're being lazy, that's not acceptable to me. And so I barked at him a little bit more and kept getting on him, and I'm like, let's go, hurry up, get to the spot. And everything, and I don't remember if my team won or not, but afterwards, the coach was there, and he brings me up, and he says, hey, Jeff, remember, he's 14, playing against 16, 17, 8-year-olds. He'll figure it out. And what he was saying is give him a little bit of a break, because going from 8th grade to playing seniors in high school is a big difference. And so the coach was saying, hey, don't scare him away just yet. Let's give him a chance. And I think I may have told this story before, but the reason I tell it today is because we are on the fruit of the Spirit called gentleness. And I recognize gentleness is probably one of the fruit that I struggle with the most. And I mean, we can debate back and forth which one I struggle with the most, but I do have some empirical data for you. And before I started this series, Becky sent out a survey to several of the leaders in the church, and they had to rank my ability on the fruit of the Spirit, and from 1 to 9. So they had to have 1 was the best, and the 9th was the worst, and so they had to do everything in between. And the one that was number 1 was by far the best score. Numbers 2 through 8 were kind of lumped together, and then we get to number 9, which is kind of way off by itself, and it is gentleness. So I share that, and this is the reason we did this survey, is because I want to make sure you know that I know I need some work on this one. Not in an arrogant way, but in a way that if you're sitting there thinking, man, this guy's talking about something he's terrible at, I know I've got work to do. And so I want to make sure we approach this with that mentality. I said last week, if the fruit of the Spirit isn't convicting you, I'm either preaching wrong or you're listening wrong. We all have work to do. I don't care where you are in your spiritual journey. We all have work to do. But we come to this fruit of gentleness. And we're going to be in 2 Timothy today, chapter 2. But we've already looked at 7 others. We've looked at the fruit of kindness, which is synonymous with easy. In Matthew 11, when Jesus says, my yoke is easy, he's using the same word that Paul uses for kindness. And lets us know that Jesus is for us and not against us. In John chapter 2, we had when Jesus turns over the temple tables, we see that it's his goodness coming out, because goodness has some type of rebuke and correction embedded in it. And so Jesus shows us that goodness does not tolerate badness. We have love, which is the Greek word agape, meaning unconquerable benevolence, which means that you love somebody else. You want the best for somebody else, even if they bother you, even if they are your enemy. And we find that if I love God, I love others. If I don't love others, I don't love God. Then we have joy and peace, and I always lump those together because they have to do with Jesus and the salvation and hope that we have in him. Joy is the fact that we have this feeling and confidence of our salvation in Jesus, and peace is that we trust the one whom we serve, that is Jesus. And so those work together. Neither one of them are circumstantial. They're not about worldly issues. They're about Jesus, his reign and his rule in our life and the hope that he provides. Then we have the fruit of patience, which I love this concept. It is a conquering persistence, that it's going to beat you down with kindness until you submit, right? That's kind of the mentality that I get. It's not aggressive, but it doesn't retaliate. It doesn't go after you. It is perseverance without retaliation. And last week we looked at faithfulness, which is dependability, trustworthiness, fidelity. And it shows that Jesus is our principal interest. It's not about what we can earn and gain in this world and accumulate. It's about Jesus. And so we come to this word gentleness that Paul uses in Galatians chapter 5. And it's the Greek word preutes, which in many ways is very untranslatable. And it's hard for us to really grasp the full meaning of this word when we translate it from Greek into English. And so it's submissive to the will of God. It's teachable. It's not proud. It's considerate. Gentleness is a disposition that's even-tempered, tranquil, or unpretentious. It's passions under control. And so I said a lot of phrases and words in there that show that we have to use a lot of different concepts to really understand what this means. And as I think about gentleness, one of the things that come to mind is that we seek to understand, but we don't back down. And so in my mind, when that 14-year-old freshman was on the basketball court, I needed to take a step back and say, this is a big change for him. Going from 8th grade basketball to playing with seniors in high school was a big deal. And so I needed to take a step back to understand him. Now, that doesn't mean we hold people to different standards, right? We don't back down. We don't say, well, that's okay, and give a pass. But this gentleness causes us to take a step back to get some perspective with that. And Jesus displayed gentleness in various ways throughout his ministry. One that comes to mind is in Matthew chapter 19, when Jesus is teaching, and all of a sudden these kids are around, and people are trying to get the children away from Jesus. He said, let the children come. See, he had the gentleness to be able to interact with children. Now, most people can interact with children. I'm not saying that but he took time for them. He met them where they were. But when we think about whether it's gentleness or any of the fruit of the Spirit, we recognize we have work to do, and we have to move forward and get to where we need to be. And we have cliches we can say, like a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. But we have to make sure we recognize where we're going. We have to understand what is the thing that we are working towards. And so I brought you may be familiar with Stephen Covey's the big rock analogy, but I brought a jar and I put some of the biggest rocks. These are red lava rocks, if you're curious. But so we put these rocks in the jar and we filled the jar. And so on some levels we say the jar is full. But in order to do this, we have to start with the biggest rocks. Because if we don't, then we're going to have our priorities askew. And the principle is you keep the big things, that you think of your life, and that if you don't do the big things, then other things are going to start filling in, and you won't have enough room for the big things. But let's get into 2 Timothy chapter 2 before we go any further with that particular analogy. But in chapter 2 of 2 Timothy, verse 15, the Apostle Paul writes, he says, work hard so you can present yourself to God and receive his approval. Be a good worker, one who is not ashamed and who correctly explains the word of truth. Avoid worthless, foolish talk that only leads to more godless behavior. This kind of talk spreads like cancer, as in the case with Hymenaeus and Philetus. They have left the path of truth by claiming that the resurrection of the dead has already occurred and have led some people away from the faith. So Paul tells us, first, be a good worker. Work hard, do your part. And part of being a good worker is knowing what the employer wants you to accomplish. You can work hard and still be a terrible worker. Right? If your employer wants you to do this and do something else, you're not a good worker. So part of being a good worker is working hard in the way that the master, the employer, wants you to work. So it means we need to know who Jesus is, we need to know what he stands for, and what he calls us to stand for. This does not mean we berate other people. It doesn't mean we just stand in an ostentatious way, spitting the truth at people to make them feel bad about themselves. But we do recognize that the truth that is in Jesus is different than what the world tries to proclaim. And there are subtle ways that we can see in things like movies and television shows how they try to portray what they say this is normal. This is a normal view of society. This is a normal way that society behaves. Whatever that may be, it says this is normal. And probably one of the most obvious examples that we see is how television and movies deal with concepts of sex. It's normal to treat that as transactional and do it how often you can with anyone with consent. And it says this is normal. Well, but what the world says is normal isn't necessarily what the Bible says is truth, because Jesus calls us to be different from the world. Not because he calls us to live a miserable life, but because he knows the lies that the world tries to tell us, he knows that they are lies. And so we get this concept of gentleness. And we think of gentleness, a lot of times it's viewed as weak, as passive. And that's not what it is. Remember, it seeks to understand, but it doesn't back down. So we can understand, we can have empathy for others without compromising what truth is. But we do have to be careful. Paul says, don't seek foolish controversies. Sometimes we just get sucked into those things, right? We get sucked into foolish arguments. And I love the phrase, don't wrestle with a pig. You both get dirty and the pig liked it. That's exactly what happens with foolish arguments. No offense to those who have raised hogs before, but that's what foolish arguments do. Both people get dirty. And I've never left a foolish argument feeling good about myself. I might have been right, but what good did it actually do? And so if we think of the fruit of patience, it endures hostility without anger. I would say that gentleness endures it without aggression. That I can see what somebody else is trying to do, and I can take a step back. I can seek to understand them, and I don't have to back down, but I also don't have to engage in the foolishness. We don't have to engage in that. But see, gentleness is not about responding to unfairness. It's not about seeking control. It's about seeking to understand without backing down. But Paul mentioned something here that the two people there, Hymenaeus and Philetus, mentioned that the resurrection of the dead had already occurred, and they were leading people astray with that particular concept. One of the things about Jesus' return, we look forward to his return. You know, there's an old-time prayer, the Lord, come quickly. We want that to happen. And you know, when Jesus returns, we're not going to question it. It's like, was that Jesus? Did Jesus come? We're not going to have a church committee to decide if Jesus came back or not. We're going to know that he came back without a question. We won't be unsure. And so this gentleness doesn't get caught up in trivial things, doesn't get caught up in wrong things, but it is harnessed power. It's not weak. It's not just being vulnerable, which is what society sometimes makes it seem. Gentleness is not being quiet when a heresy is mentioned. It's not allowing itself to be bullied. But as we think about gentleness, I wonder, how do you respond to these types of things? When you receive correction or rebuke, how do you respond? Now, most of the time, probably like 99.99999% of the time, when someone gives you correction or a rebuke, there's at least a sliver that you can take from that. Every once in a while, 0.00001% of the time, they may be completely false in everything they say about you. But almost every time somebody gives you correction or rebuke, even if it's unfair, even if it's mean-spirited, you can glean something from that. You say, what is the truth here? What is something I can take away from this? Not as though we treat every correction and rebuke the same, but to recognize, how do you respond to rebuke and correction? Do you push it away? Do you fight it? Do you ignore it? My college coach would often say this phrase. He says, only a fool learns from his mistakes. The wise man learns from the mistakes of others. that if you have to endure something yourself to learn, that's what most people do, right? If I put my hand on a hot stove, I'm going to, oh, well, that's hot. That's a bad idea. But if I see somebody else put their hand on the stove and they say it's hot, and then I say, you know what? I'm not going to do that. I haven't endured the pain, but I've gained the lesson. See, I know not to put my hand on the stove if I've already put my hand on the stove. So, but what are we taking from correction and rebuke? How can we respond to these? But again, Jesus shows us how to be gentle. In John chapter 4, he encounters the Samaritan woman at the well, and there were many reasons why Jesus could have brushed her off, could have ignored her, could have been holier than thou towards this individual, but he didn't. He met her where she was. And if you read all of John chapter 4, you find that her life was changed, and she went and told others about it, and their lives were changed because Jesus met her where she was. He didn't back down from the truth, but he sought to understand. He had empathy. He met her where she was. So again, we have to keep the big things, the big things. And if we want to maximize the capacity of what we can accomplish, we have to make sure we put the big rocks in first. Now, when I say maximize our capacity, it's not just about you doing more. It's about using what you have effectively for Jesus. Because if we want to put more rocks in there, we can. And we shake it up, and then rocks fall to the bottom. And we put more rocks in. And we shake it up and try to get them as much to the bottom as possible. And again, it's not just about squeezing more into your life, but it's about recognizing what Jesus has given you and how can you use it better for Him. And so we can fill up. I probably shouldn't have filled it that high, but we filled it up. And so we have put more in here. We've increased our capacity, but we didn't actually add more space. We increased our capacity because we kept the big things, the big things. And that's really important as we try to pursue Jesus in this world today. But the Apostle Paul continues in verse 19. He says, but God's truth is our cornerstone with this inscription, the Lord knows those who are His, and all who belong to the Lord must turn away from evil. In a wealthy home, some utensils are made of gold and silver, and others of clay and wood. The expensive utensils are used for special occasions, and the cheaper ones for everyday use. If you keep yourself pure, you will be a special utensil for honorable use. Your life will be clean, and you'll be ready for the Master to use you for every good work. Run from lust. Pursue righteousness, faithfulness, love, and peace. Enjoy companionship of those who call on the Lord with pure hearts. And so part of what we say here is Jesus is our foundation. And we have to keep Jesus as the center, as the core, as the big thing in our life. And what we're doing here is meaningless without Jesus. If Jesus did not rise from the grave, we might as well not be here. In 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul says we might as well eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. If Jesus isn't alive, that is what we do. But gentleness is not weakness. It is strength under control. See, gentleness can do things like forgive. It knows when to speak. It knows when to remain quiet. It knows when to be soft. It knows when to be strong, because gentleness seeks to understand, but it doesn't back down. Now, this concept of purity that Apostle Paul talks about is difficult. He uses the utensils of silver and gold and being pure in our world. It's hard to remain pure in our world. We talked a minute ago about, television and movies try to tell us what is normal. And then we go out into the world, our jobs or schools or wherever, and that is how the world is functioning. And it's hard to remain pure in a world that doesn't necessarily honor Jesus. Now, we shouldn't take time lamenting that moaning and groaning, well, the world's a bad place. Well, the world's always been a bad place. It's always been a place that was evil and full of darkness, which is why we need to make sure we continually come to Jesus to be cleansed. Whether we're talking about a gathering at church or whether we're talking about our daily time with Jesus, we need to continually go to Him to be cleansed and protected from the things of this world. And when we do that, then we can always be ready for Jesus to use us. See, getting ready for Jesus to use you is not like getting ready for an event. It's living life. If Jesus can only use you at special times, then I think we're missing the point. Jesus wants to use you at lunch. He wants to use you this afternoon. He wants to use you at work tomorrow. He wants to use you at the grocery store. He wants to use you at all times. So the Apostle Paul talks about these special utensils. Well, Jesus wants to use you for the world to see what he can do in them. So we always have to be ready. Now the Greeks had the word praeos, or the word gentleness is preutes, but preus is a Greek word that they would use to describe an animal that had been tamed. So when you think of a horse that has been broken. Now, I've never been part of that process, but I know it can be interesting at best of breaking a horse. Now, the breaking a horse is not trying to get it to be less of a horse, but it's trying to be able to use that power the horse has. Because a horse has power. In fact, that's how we measure cars. It has this much horsepower, right? And so it's when a horse is broken, it still is strong, but its power is now under control. So I wonder, are you under control? Have you been broken by Jesus? How do you respond to others? When we have the fruit of gentleness, we don't run when frightened. We don't lash out. We don't harm others. Gentleness changes our behavior. So Paul tells us to pursue righteousness and faithfulness and love and peace. And three of those are fruit. Righteousness is more of a generic term, but faithfulness, love, and peace are fruit of the Spirit. But Paul is not being legalistic here. In fact, after he shares the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5, he says, against such things there is no law. Following Jesus is not about following rules. It's about allowing the Spirit to change you and being faithful to Jesus. Now, there are principles that we apply from one person to the next, but following Jesus is not a legalistic set of rules. Now, we all will face criticism, and sometimes we need some thick skin. Sometimes we need to absorb it. And that's hard. It is. Maybe you're really good at it, but most people aren't good at receiving criticism. We don't like being told we're wrong. I don't know when we transition, but kids going through school are used to being told they're wrong on things. And they learn from that, and they grow. So sometimes we need some thick skin. Sometimes we need discernment and wisdom on how to proceed. But even if we're talking about thick skin, we cannot allow, whether it's criticism, whether it's the world, whatever it is, to harden us to the point that we push others away. See, we must be gentle even when we face criticism, whether it's fair or not. But if we come back to Jesus, probably the ultimate way we think about Jesus displaying gentleness for us was his work on the cross. Jesus endured horrific pain and suffering for you and me. Now, there was no reason he had to do it. He was not obligated to do it. He did it because he loves us. There was nothing that controlled him to do it. But he even had compassion on those who were harming him. And so you may have difficult situations in life and say, you don't know my situation. You don't know what I'm going through. You don't know all this and that. And you know what? You're right, I don't. But you're going to be hard-pressed to convince me that your situation is worse than Jesus. Well, Jesus responded with gentleness to those who were physically harming him, in part because he had in mind the will of the Father. He didn't have his own ambitions. He submitted himself. And so we come to rocks. If we have the big things, then we can put more things in. We get some sand going in there and fill all those cracks, and it will sink all the way down to the bottom. You know what? And it takes some time for things to fall into place. This is not one of those quick fix things that will all of a sudden just happen magically just because we wish it would happen. It takes work. It takes effort. You shake this stuff down to the bottom and it will get to where it needs to go. But the big things stay the big things. The things that are most important will stay where they are supposed to stay. So we think about Jesus as our cornerstone, as our foundation. We affirm things, Jesus knows us and Jesus loves us. But this is not about just adding more things into your life. It's not about increasing your capacity. It's about maximizing the capacity that Jesus has already gifted you to have. And see, when we don't keep the big things, we miss opportunities for Jesus. And really, we miss out on life, and people miss out on the impact that Jesus would have for them. See, but it takes time. So I don't know where you are on this type of situation, with what your priorities are, what your schedules are. It takes time for things to settle. It takes time for these little things to get to where they need to be. But no matter where you are, I want to encourage you the fact that Jesus calls us to make sure we keep things in the proper perspective and in the proper place. Well, the Apostle Paul has just a little bit more I want to get to today. And he reiterates, starting in verse 23, he says, again, I say, don't get involved in foolish, ignorant arguments that only lead to fights. A servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but a servant of the Lord must be kind to everyone, must be able to teach, and must be patient with difficult people. That's a verse worth repeating, right? A servant of the Lord must not quarrel. A servant of the Lord must be kind to everyone, be able to teach, and be patient with difficult people. You know what? You're the difficult person sometimes. Make sure you remember that. But gently instruct those who oppose the truth. Perhaps God will change their hearts and they will learn the truth. Then they will escape from the devil's trap, for they've been held captive by him. So Paul comes back and says, don't be distracted by the unimportant. Don't get caught up in things that only lead to foolish arguments. Don't get caught up in things that are detrimental to actually what he has called you to do. Earlier, I mentioned that gentleness has some concepts of meekness involved. And originally in my notes, I put down here, there are certain people that we don't want to be meek, or we don't want them to be gentle. You can think of the president. You can think of generals or the CEOs of big companies. We don't want them to be meek, right? We don't want them to be gentle. What Paul is actually referring to here is it's power under control. It's not about being weak. So we can have our top leaders display this fruit of gentleness and still be effective. Power under control doesn't mean you're weak. It means you know when to use the power and you know when not to use the power. It takes a step back and says, I'm going to try to understand before I act, but I'm not going to back down. But Paul used the word servants. He says, servants of the Lord should not quarrel. And we always have to remember that we are servants. We are servants of the Master who is Jesus. We are not constituents. We're not voting members. We're not people with to say we are servants, and as servants we serve at the pleasure of the Master. It's not about me. It's not about what I want. It's about serving Jesus. So when you encounter difficult people, be patient with them. Again, sometimes you're the difficult person. We don't like to admit that. Now, being patient with someone doesn't mean that you have to endure their baggage or their nonsense. You don't have to get caught up in foolish arguments. But see, being bold and gentle can work together. When you think of Jesus, he was gentle, but he wasn't passive. He submitted to God's plan, but that doesn't mean he was passive or withdrawing. He was bold and courageous, and he followed God's plan without hesitancy. But being submissive or being gentle is submissive to God's plan. It's being teachable, considerate. We don't try to manipulate others for our own purposes. It cares about them. Because you know what? The goal of the gospel message is freedom. Paul says, gently instruct those who oppose the truth. Because they have been held captive by Satan. And if God changes their hearts and they learn the truth, then they can be free from that. So when we're being gentle to those who oppose the truth, or those who are being indignant towards us or mean to us, we're hoping that our actions can help them respond to Jesus. And then they can be free from the things that Satan is holding in their lives. Gentleness doesn't mean that we're a punching bag. In fact, that's one of the connotations that the Greeks would have, that they see this concept of gentleness as weak, but it's not. But when I think of Jesus and gentleness, there's one particular moment that always sticks out to me. When Jesus was eating with his disciples on the Last Supper, he told them that they would all betray him. And Peter stands up, the bold one, says, "No, not I, Lord. Even if I'd have to die, I would not betray you or deny you." Well, in Luke chapter 22, verse 61, right after the rooster crowed, it says, "At that moment, Jesus turned and looked at Peter. Suddenly, the Lord's words flashed through Peter's mind. 'Before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny 3 times that you even know me.'" And I always think about that moment of Jesus as being crucified. He is in significant agony and pain, and the rooster crows, and he turns and he looks and he catches Peter's eye. I don't know exactly what was going through Jesus' mind or Peter's mind. I'm not trying to claim that I do. But Peter had just denied Jesus, and he made eye contact with Jesus. I'm sure Peter felt as small as you could possibly be. But I don't think Jesus' look at Peter was a look of condemnation. It was not a look of, you're dead to me. It was a look of, I told you so, but I'm doing this even though I knew that was going to happen. And so maybe I shouldn't say Jesus was thinking, I told you so. Jesus knows that you're imperfect, and yet he still died for you. He did that. And so his gentleness is willing to lay his life down for others so that they might know him. And I hope we don't forget that, because that's part of the big thing here, is the gentleness that Jesus displayed for us. And you know what? We can still fit more in here. But again, the issue is not that we just increase our capacity, but that we maximize our capacity. And we put water here and we let it settle, and it goes down to the bottom. It takes a while, just like the sand. It takes a while to sink down there, but eventually it permeates through all of us. And you probably can't see it, but I can see it soaking in to the sand as it goes down and further and further. You see, Jesus allows us to maximize what we've been given, because I don't care who you are, you want to live a meaningful life. You want to live a life that's meaningful, but it can only be meaningful if we really keep the big things the big things. It can only be meaningful if we allow Jesus to be the foundation, the cornerstone that the Apostle Paul tells us. But when I think about gentleness, I come back to the horse. It's power under control. And the only way that horse has power that's under control is that it first and foremost is broken. I think there are too many people who are trying to follow Jesus without being broken first. Because you're not going to be gentle authentically if you're not broken for Jesus. We got to keep the big things the big things. And one of the big things is not that you look the part. That's not the big thing. That may come once you keep the big things the big things. But we have to be willing to look foolish. We have to be willing to be judged by others because we are imperfect and we're trying to deal with that. But until we do, until we have that courage, I'm not sure we're going to be broken in the way that Jesus calls us to be broken.